Okay,
Great.
so before we start, I just want to give a quick introduction. Um, Ravi Dutta Powell is a senior advisor based in the Behavioural Insights team Sydney office, experienced in applying behavioural insights in a wide range of policy areas. He has helped many regulators understand and overcome behavioural barriers to compliance, and is co-author of WBIT's Applying Behavioural Insights to Regulated Markets. Here to discuss the topic, Understanding Remittance Behaviors of Pacific Workers and Diaspora, let's welcome our speaker. It's good to have you here. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Look, I think I'll give you some insights from the work that we did. But if there's one sort of key takeaway from my talk today that I want you to think about, it's this. When we talk about behavioural biases, we often sort of implicitly, or it's often explicitly, assume that they are irrational biases. I think what this project showed us, more so than I think many other projects we've done before, is that actually many behavioural biases are entirely rational. There's a good basis for a lot of biases, but where people kind of get into trouble is when those biases, when they kind of default to those biases, when they may not necessarily apply or be the best way of making a decision. So, I mean, we'll go through and I'll give you some examples of exactly what I'm talking about. So this was a really interesting project we did in 2019, where we were working with a couple of government departments in Australia and New Zealand to learn a bit more about remittances from Australia and New Zealand to the Pacific. So, look, I'll go through very quickly what the challenge is and what we did, and then most of the time I'll talk about some of the insights and then Q&A. So basically, very, very quick background. Obviously, remittances are a key source of income for Pacific Island nations. So, I mean, you can see there, obviously, $160 million Australian from Australia alone in 2017. But the average cost of remitting from Australia and New Zealand, or the kind of, I guess, the transfer fees and all those things together, it's around about 10%. The global average for most kind of corridors is around 7%. Now, I mean, this is due to a range of factors. Some of those are sort of systemic market factors, and so the size of the market and things like that. But a big part of that is also kind of behavioural factors and the choices that people make. And indeed, as Elliot was saying, a lot of problems have a behavioural element to them, as does this one. And it's a kind of an interesting question as to how much the system influences the behaviour and vice versa. Those two things are obviously closely interconnected. So what we were tasked with doing is speaking to a range of interviewees across Australia and New Zealand. So some were diaspora, so people from the Pacific Islands living in Australia and New Zealand. And some were labour mobility workers. So these are basically people who come out on special visas and work in Australia, usually on New Zealand, and usually picking fruit or on farms, things like that. And there's a few different programs across both countries. They came from a range of countries, so Samoa, Tonga, Vanuatu, Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands. I mean, those make up sort of the big, certainly those first four are sort of big contributors to the population in Australia and New Zealand, both into the diaspora and labour mobility workers. And basically, we're trying to find out kind of how do people make their decisions? Why do they make the decisions they do when they're remitting money back to their home countries? So, look, I'll go through some of the kind of insights that we found. But I think the first one to frame this, I think an important one to think about. Remitting is a really personal action. It's not transactional. Whereas we might think of it as a very transactional process, just a financial decision devoid of any kind of meaning. It's actually really, really important to a lot of these people. So, the sole reason that a lot of workers leave home, and then, I mean, they leave home for 3, 6, 12, sometimes, 18 months at a time. The sole reason they do it is to earn money and provide for their family. Meanwhile, for those who are diaspora, so living in Australia or New Zealand, remitting was really tied to their sense of identity and was this really strong link back to their communities back in their home countries. And people were often remitting to help families fund quite fundamental things. So it was essentials like groceries, bills, school fees. but also cultural things like weddings, church contributions, funerals, things like that. This is a real personal element. And there's a really, really lovely quote from a guy who was actually kind of in the process of becoming the sort of chief of the head chief of his community. He said, it's not that you're sending money, you're sending your heart, which I thought was really summed it up. And so it's something to sort of keep in mind when we think about the decisions that people make. We sometimes think that they're going to be kind of purely rational things, but actually there may be a much deeper emotional driver for a lot of behaviour. And so, we had to think about what some solutions might be, and these haven't been progressed yet. These are really just sort of thoughts or ideas at this stage, but some things you could think about to try and draw on this and to drive behaviour change might be to kind of send people kind of postcards from home. Prompt people to search for competitors and kind of remind them that getting a sort of a cheaper rate means getting more money into the pockets of their families, or targeting the workers' families to prompt conversations about services. There's some interesting work. I'm sure many of you are familiar that financial literacy training has a sort of mixed track record. But one of the things that can work, particularly with overseas workers, is sort of speaking not just to them but to their families as well, and sort of speaking to those people to try and help them manage those finances. So the next kind of key insight that we got was sort of trust and access are critical when choosing a provider. I actually want to do a little exercise, and it's slightly modified from what we did when we were presenting this to the people at the government departments. I want you to imagine for a second you want to buy a TV. So you found a good TV that you want to buy. It's like a 55-inch Samsung TV, 4K LED. It's available at Best Buy, or choose your large retailer of choice. I'm sure you can think of an equivalent one in your home country. And it's a Samsung TV, flat screen. It's got everything you want, and it's for sale for, let's say, $1,500 or whatever your preferred currency is. But you Google around and you're trying to find the best price for yourself, and looks like you can find what appears to be an identical TV, and it's at this website, affordableappliances.com.au, and it's a Shasweedga TV. Now, obviously, the name's a bit funny, but everything looks to be identical. The TV looks to be the same, has the same specs. It looks like actually seems like it's one of those things where it's manufactured in the same factory even. They just stick a different label on it. Now, this one's for sale for $1,450. I won't get you trying to go through this, but if you're interested in talking about this, maybe make a note of it. But I'd be interested to see, and think about how many of you would actually choose the cheaper TV. Obviously, we kind of can't go through the exercise at the moment, but one thing I would say, when we did this when we do this exercise, what we find is that most people say, well, you know what, I probably wouldn't choose the kind of cheaper TV in this case. Maybe if it's a little bit cheaper, but if it's just $50 off, I probably wouldn't choose it. And I think it's a really good demonstration of a number of behavioural biases, or a couple of behavioural biases, and actually why they're not a bad idea, why behavioural biases in this case are actually quite sensible. So what's going on here, as I'm sure many of you realise, is there's a bit of familiarity effect going on. You are familiar with Samsung. You've heard of Samsung. It's a reputable brand. You know that they make quality TVs. You've heard of Best Buy or whatever the kind of large retailer in your country is. You know that they provide decent, reputable things. They will have tested these products. You know that if something goes wrong, you can take the product back to Samsung or back to the retailer. You know that you have recourse, right? You've never heard of this affordable appliances website. You never heard of Shasweedga. You don't know if it's a kind of a new brand or just a fly-by-night operator, or it's going to disappear if something goes wrong. You just there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of things that you really don't know about. You can't use. So interestingly, just kind of for background, for those of you who did choose to take up the cheaper offer, Shasweedga is a real brand. I promise you, this is a genuinely real brand. You can Google it. Basically, they make knockoff Samsung TVs, which is why I put it in. But affordableappliances.com.au is a website that I got from a list of websites that's actually been shut down by one of the state governments here in Australia for being a scam website. So those of you who would have bought from it, you actually would have been stung by the scam. Which, but again, it kind of goes to show the point that I'm making, is that we have this bias towards familiarity for a very good reason. And I think that kind of helps to explain what we're talking about here. which is that remitters really needed to trust the provider was reliable. I mean, when you think about it, money, ultimately is all about trust, right? You trust that the £5 or $5 note in your wallet is going to be accepted by the shopkeeper, and that the shopkeeper trusts they'll be able to pay their taxes with, and all that sort of stuff. And so, because of the importance of the act of remitting, there's a real premium on ensuring funds actually arrive. Things that sort of influence this trust, like the fact that you've used it before, the fact that you know the brand, testimonies, lots of touch points and things like that. And one thing we found really interesting is a lot of people would go in, particularly diaspora, and once they really liked seeing the agents actually physically faxing the form off, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. But they really liked seeing that form being faxed off because it gave them a sense of something happening. And violation of the service massively impacted the kind of likelihood of reuse. There was one example, and there was kind of stories told about this one worker who sent money home, but the provider at the other end didn't have enough cash. And this had this kind of terrible knock-on effect where the family couldn't pay the school fees, and the daughter was sent home and had to kind of stay back, and cause a huge impact. And obviously, they never went back to that one provider. And so, trust is really, really key, and reliability in terms of why people choose a remittance provider. And these are kind of some of the kind of quotes that we got. That MoneyGram is good, but I trust Western Union. I feel secure. And similarly, kind of immediacy was often really important for sort of perceptions of reliability. And so, often kind of requests were unexpected or urgent. But interestingly, even when it wasn't urgent, people still preferred immediate transfer and kind of liked that and saw that as a sort of a point of quality. It's interesting. One person from the diaspora was saying, other people tell me about other ways to send money and tell me they're cheaper, but then it tells me an hour so it takes an hour for the money to get there. And I said, no, I'll stick with my kind of incumbent provider. And so, even there where, it may not be as urgent, even if it's only kind of an hour's difference, they still feel that reliability, that immediacy is really powerful. Interestingly, physical access is also really, really important. And this cuts a few ways. So most people remitted almost exclusively in person. So in remote locations, particularly when these people work in regional areas, on farms and things like that, it's sort of the only option is at the post office. In New Zealand, there's a bit more competition, but again, it's located what's near them. Diaspora tend to sort of incorporate physical locations into their routes and routines. So they like to, when they go shopping every week for the groceries, like what's the kind of remittance provider that's sort of near them. But interestingly, it sort of obviously speaks to kind of cultural expectations, but it also is something that sort of has to work for receivers. And remitters actually think about not just kind of where am I going to send the money, but where's the other person going to pick it up? And I guess this was best summed up in a quote. And this quote is, I think, the kind of my favorite quote from my whole time in kind of working at BIT and in all the kind of work I've done. I think it's probably my favorite quote ever, where this guy was saying, look, if I used a different provider, my family would need to take a boat to another island to pick up the money. And that's a pretty compelling reason to sort of stick with your incumbent provider. And I think not everyone's case was that extreme, but I think for a lot of people there was this sort of real premium on where am I going to drop off the money, and importantly, where's my family going to pick it up and how they're going to do that? What are the sort of logistics of doing that sort of thing? Another one, I think we can all sort of appreciate this inertia, and driven by sort of familiarity and increases loyalty to incumbent providers. And again, I think the kind of best example to sort of motivate this, if you think about your own life, who among us can say that they have changed their mobile phone provider, their internet provider, their energy provider, their gas provider, their cable TV or what have you, within their banking provider in the last 12 months? Unless you've moved house, which is probably the only reason you would do those things. Most people can't say they've changed all of those things in sort of the last 12 months. And again, it's because the kind of inertia and familiarity that we all have, and that kind of really strong status quo bias, absolutely plays out here in the remitting world as well. So for diaspora, this kind of inertia and sort of the lack of real motivating factors leads to people just sticking with the default. It's particularly strong, I think, with diaspora, and there's other things that they sort of did, like ecosystem strategies, and like keeping customer ID details, made it really kind of convenient to stick with the same provider. I think a kind of classic thing that most people do with a lot of things, I just stick with this one because it's there and I know it and I've been using it for years. So some of the solutions you could think about would be, applying trust marks or guarantees to kind of different providers on Send Money Pacific, which is a sort of a comparison site. Allowing for peer reviewing or rating system to increase trust in alternate providers. And sharing report findings to the remitting sector to sort of encourage service evolution. The next insight was just that remitting behaviour is largely shaped by social factors. And so again, to kind of motivate this sort of insight, I want you to think about where you work or where you go to university or when you started somewhere new. How did you learn where to get coffee? And think about the first time that you kind of got coffee, particularly if you're working or kind of at a new place and some people there. You'll find often what happens is someone else takes you, right? You start on a new job, your manager or your buddy or your coworker will take you out to coffee, and that's what you kind of learn. Where's the kind of coffee place nearby, and you slowly will kind of learn. You might go exploring once you've got a bit of confidence, but usually the kind of first steps will be someone else teaching you. And more broadly, like how do you or people learn about brands? It's through sort of advertising, through the community, through things like that. I mean, this is just an kind of example of some of the sort of sponsors of one of the kind of Pacific Islander events in Australia, and some of the sponsors there are kind of remittance providers essentially. And I think this really is important, that the way that we learn about a lot of things is through kind of social networks, right? For diaspora, kind of family, friends, community leaders are key actors. I mean, if you think about when you need a tradesperson, or when you need some services, or when you are going on holidays, you often speak to the people around you. What have you done? What have you found? What was good? Who's good? Can you help me out? Those are the sorts of things that you'll do. It's quite important. People talk about sending money, especially about the rates. People kind of do talk about it a lot and kind of talk between groups, and then the group behaviour is really important. But it was really, really powerful for workers. So, think about it. You come to a new country, you've got a new job, you're doing all sorts of things, lots of things going on. And so the influence of other people can be really powerful, particularly employers. Often of these employers would have kind of pastoral care workers employees, but other workers in particular as well. I think this is, we only know about sort of Western Union because everyone knows Western Union. I think this one sort of was a really good one. The boys already come here, teach me, so I use Western Union, and it was really, really common, in fact, because what would happen is that people would often go together. Workers would actually all kind of drive together in one car as a group to go and remit. And so, if you're the new guy in the group, you would kind of go with everyone else and kind of remit the same way that they remit. And so that way, the kind of social influence was really, really strong. And then, you kind of eventually you might become the kind of old and wizened hand, but you just kind of teach the same thing that you've been doing for the last few years to the new people coming through. And so, one of the kind of solutions there could think of, well, who are those key actors in the networks of the workers in diaspora? Can you kind of target specific people to kind of drive behavioural change? Because that might be a key way to do things. The final one I'll talk about, which is quite interesting. So, unsurprisingly, sort of low digital literacy can be a barrier to kind of meaningful engagement in a lot of cases. So, again, I'm going to do a little bit of an exercise. Again, we probably won't be able to go through the answers in detail and have a bit of back and forth, but if you've got questions, I'm happy to sort of discuss them at the end. We're going to do a quick little exercise. I'm going to show you some potential communications. I want you to work out if they're sort of a serious or a scam. So just maybe get a pen and paper, or you're on your laptop, so maybe open a Word doc and just kind of note down if you think they're a serious or a scam. We'll give you a few seconds on each of them. So the first one, this one, you get this message you get this message, have a read of it. I want you to write down, do you think it's serious or a scam? So if you got this text, do you think you would just go ahead with it, or would you call your bank if you weren't expecting it? So just give me one sec. So is that serious or is it a scam? So this one. So you get this text from your bank querying a recent transaction. So would you call the number? Do you think this is serious or a scam? Now, let's imagine you're having some plumbing done or some electrical work or something like that. And you get this email from your plumber or your tradesperson to notify you of some changes to the bank details before you're meant to send the fee. So, do you think this is serious or a scam? And this question, this one here, you get this text informing you that your card has been blocked due to unexpected transactions. Do you think it is serious or a scam? Finally, your bank texts you to say there's a problem with your account login. Would you call the number to fix the problem or not? Is it serious or is it a scam? So I'll go through the answers in a second very quickly. Basically, I think it's worth noting this is taken, so we took this from an online quiz, which actually has 8 questions. We stripped out basically 3 of the easiest ones. And of those 8 questions, only less than 10% got all of them correct. And so here's the answers for them. So the first one was serious, the next 2 were a scam, the 4th one was serious, and the 5th one was a scam. Obviously, if anyone got them all right, well done to you. But we kind of designed it to make it as hard as possible. But as I said, this is taken from an online quiz, and less than 10% get 8 questions right. Now, think about it. Obviously, we are all educated people. With kind of experience with working online. Obviously, we're educated, we're intelligent, kind of good grasp of the English language and finances and things like that. And yet, I'm guessing probably most people got at least one of them wrong. Now, if it's hard for us to know what's a scam and what's not, how do you think someone who's coming to a completely new country, lower financial skills, lower digital literacy, lower English literacy, how are they going to do judging what is and isn't a scam, right? There's going to be a lot of quite legitimate trepidation and hesitation when it comes to online transactions. And that's what we saw, kind of very few, a relatively small proportion had used online providers, quite low literacy online, less so in diaspora. I mean, in diaspora, we saw it a little bit, particularly older generations. And that kind of amplified the importance of trust when choosing providers and the importance of physical location and things like that. It's really interesting, people kind of saying, look, I want to send the money with the app, but I don't want to waste time going to the bank, but, I don't know how to do this. What's really interesting is that sort of word of mouth and sort of testimonials help proliferate doubts about online providers. And it's interesting because the employers and their pastoral care workers would tell the kind of workers coming across, hey, be wary of online scams. And so people would just kind of just stay away from anything online in some cases. But interestingly, in some cases where the behavior did spread, it was again through word of mouth, and it was again through kind of 1 or 2 people driving that behavior and remitting on behalf of a sort of larger group. Again, you can sort of see the importance of that trust coming through. I think the biggest issue with those services is just whether money is going to get there. And as a result, kind of low digital literacy means that the other factors become more important. So that familiarity, that trust, proximity, the positive experiences and validation and things like that. One bad story could sort of end a person's trust in those sort of online providers, and because of those social factors we spoke about, that trust spread really. That distrust rather was spread really quickly. Probably my sort of favorite demonstration, I think, of this sort of lack of trust in online remittances. There was this one worker we spoke to in New Zealand. He'd actually appeared in promotional videos for a bank to kind of spruik their remittance service. But despite having appeared in that, when we asked him, do you use that bank's remittance service? He said, oh, no, I stay away from all that online stuff. I just use Western Union, because his employer had warned him against online scams, and so he was kind of ruled out anything to do with sort of online online remitting. It was a really, really sort of interesting, I think, and kind of fascinating demonstration of this point. And so, what are some things you could think about? Increasing digital literacy through training, improving send money specific usability, but also just, again, going back to that point we made earlier, targeting some of those key actors in the group. So, if you can get someone who really drives that behavior and get them to remit online, that might be a way to sort of spread it amongst small groups, both in diaspora and in workers. So look, I've been talking for quite a while, so I might wrap it up there, and we can have some sort of questions or discussions. Happy to take anything from the floor if people want to discuss. So I think the Warwick team will be handling that. So let me know if you've got questions.
Yeah, thank you, Ravi, for this insightful presentation. Now we have about 10 minutes for questions. Please raise your hands to go on stage or use the chat option. We have the first question. How online platforms can build trust?
It's a really good question, and I think that it's not one that there's like a sort of easy, quick answer. I think it's a trickier, longer-term process. I mean, part of it might just be, kind of good old-fashioned, sponsorship and advertising, and quite targeted advertising at the group. So just to build that basic familiarity, right? So people get used to hearing the name and feel like it's been around and it's an established presence and it's not just kind of a fly-by-night operation. I think a second element of that is perhaps, again, going beyond just the system itself and thinking about, well, where do people find out about these sorts of things? How do they learn about it? Can those providers build sort of their reputation in that space? Can they find out about, are there ways to work with some of those key groups? So it might be community groups for diaspora. It might be employers or the schemes that manage some of those labour mobility schemes, kind of working with them to build skills and kind of digital literacy and for the people coming across and finding ways to sort of improve those sorts of things. But I mean, I think it's something that is really kind of can require a multifaceted approach. There's no kind of one easy sort of quick answer.
Okay, thank you. We have the next question. What were the actions taken from this research, particularly the government and banks? What improvements have we seen in the money transfer providers lately?
It's a good question. So my understanding is that at the moment, the government is based, I mean, as you might appreciate, governments move slowly. And so at the moment, I think they're in the process of overhauling some of the systems. So I think I flagged Send Money Pacific. It's basically an online comparison website. I think that's in the process of being overhauled, and there are a number of other kind of initiatives ongoing to I think there is a process going in to try and apply some of the lessons from this research. I can't probably speak as much about that at the moment, but yeah, my understanding is that there is some sort of work underway. So I think there's another question here about using quantitative methods of research or project. Yeah, look, absolutely. I mean, I think it's also dependent on kind of context and what you have available and what you can do. Absolutely. I think there'd be some really interesting quantitative work you could do. You could kind of do this at a larger scale and kind of start pulling together some sort of more survey data. And I mean, obviously we spoke to, quite a few people across a range of interviews and could start to get some very simple quantitative data. But I mean, you're just sort of limited to some extent by limited a little bit by kind of what you have available, right? And it is generally easier, I think, to do those sort of qualitative things. Quantitative things are harder and require greater scale and require, I mean, either kind of access to kind of quite large numbers or the ability to sort of manipulate some sort of existing touch point, which isn't always going to exist.
Okay, we have a few more questions. And the first, what is the statistical tool most often used in the team? Stata, R, Python, or something else?
Usually R, but I think it depends a little bit. I think some people use Stata, but I'd say R is probably the dominant one. But it's one of R or Stata.
The other interesting question, we know that social networks are critical factors for adoption of uncertain money transfer services. How do you think the social networks and norms can be practically used to boost usage and trust, given the differential culture sensitivity, maybe?
Yep. So I think there's a few things there, and I think it's sort of kind of touched on them a little bit. So I think it's firstly about understanding exactly how those networks work and those norms operate. And what I mean by that is not obviously just that obviously they exist, but kind of understanding at a kind of deeper level what's driving them. And so what I mean by that is, who are the experienced people in the group who, like who's the guy who drives everyone to the post office to remit on a Friday night? Who's the person who has the mobile phone and kind of remits using the online app for the other 5 people in their house, right? Understanding those groups those people is really, really important, because those are often the kind of the keys or the linchpin to the whole group. Because if that person changes their behavior, then it's probably going to have a strong influence on a lot of other people. It's going to have a real kind of knock-on effect, because put bluntly, if you're the person driving them to the remittance place and you drive them to a different one, then they're probably going to start remitting at the different place. That's not always possible for structural factors, but I mean those are the sorts of things to sort of think about in terms of how you use those groups. And I think it's also just about thinking about what are some of those ways to build trust and access some of those groups. I mean, these are quite tight-knit communities, both in terms of diaspora and in terms of labour mobility workers. And so finding other ways in, whether it's through the employers or through the schemes or through, often, as I said, those employers often have pastoral care workers, so people whose responsibility is kind of looking after the pastoral care of the labour mobility workers. And those people often provide a lot of guidance on basic things like, how to get a bank account, how to get mobile phones, things like really basic things to help set up your life. Those are the sorts of things, those people can be the sorts of people who are really good channels to kind of go in with.
Okay, we have more questions. What qualitative method of research analysis was used to draw out the insights in this study?
So it's a bit of an iterative process as we went along. I mean, we sort of, we used kind of an emergence insights approach where we sort of, brought everything together and sort of went through a few rounds of revisions. I mean, it's something that varies from project to project. And in this case, it is something that, we did quite a few interviews, and I think we had some sort of initial hypotheses, and we actually changed our approach partway through, based on what was coming out, to probe different ideas. And so I think probably the kind of best summary is to say that it was a sort of an iterative analytical approach that kind of went on as the project went on.
Okay, thank you. Another way of building trust on new fintechs related to money transfers could be identifying those personalities who are likely to be influential in their tribe's community and who are most likely to educate their surroundings. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's the sort of the point I was making, right? Is that finding those people who influence other people's behavior, whether it's through actually being the one that does the behavior, or through being a sort of notional thought leader, or someone who people listen to and respect as an option. That's often a really key part, particularly in close-knit communities.
The other question is, has it been explored how messenger effects can help boost trust through partnerships with trusted brands and entities?
That's a really good question. I don't know in this particular context if it's been explored. it'd be an interesting one to sort of find out if there are specific brands or entities that you could partner with as an emerging kind of fintech provider to try and build that trust. Yeah, I mean, I think it is quite context dependent. I don't know for this specific context, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. Given the small sample size, how did you make sure that the sample is representative of the target population?
So put bluntly, we didn't. It wasn't a representative sample, and I think it's worth. We were kind of quite upfront with that with the government department, so it's worth kind of flagging that as well. This wasn't a representative sample because of the nature of the group that we're talking about. It's very tricky to kind of get a perfectly representative sample. So there's a few different things going on. Geographically, it's very, very dispersed. Secondly, for people who are labour mobility workers, you kind of have to get agreement from their employers as well to be able to speak to them, and so that automatically will kind of bias your sample because some people won't want to have them speak to you, and that's just kind of there's not much you can do. And also, limited kind of time and resources means that it doesn't make sense to sort of speak to kind of one person at each different farm. Actually, it makes more sense to speak to 5 to 10 people at a smaller number of farms rather than kind of one person at sort of 50 different farms. But again, that necessarily means that you are skewing your kind of group a little bit. So it wasn't representative. It probably can't be representative without having sort of 5 to 10 times the kind of time and budget to do it. And I mean, to be honest, I don't think that you would gain that much from being representative. You'd probably be able to tell more whether the kind of trends, like how prevalent some of those kind of trends were in terms of online remitting, use of different providers and things like that. But I don't think the insights would change substantially by being more representative.
Okay, we are out of time, so I guess we will have to end now. But thank you so much, Ravi, for giving this interesting presentation and amazing Q&A session. And now I think we'll go to the next session.